Hello and welcome to the News Bystanders. The US has marked a year since Russia invaded Ukraine by announcing a new range of sanctions against Russia and new military aid for Ukraine. The latest restrictions target more than 100 entities, both within Russia and worldwide, including banks and suppliers of defense equipment. Specifically, the US said it wants to stop those helping Russia exploit loopholes to get sanctioned materials. The White House's fresh round of aid for Ukraine is worth $2 billion. A further $500 million will be supplied to both Ukraine and neighbouring Moldova to strengthen their energy infrastructure. 1 year on, the commitment of the United States, together with some 50 countries who've rallied to rush urgently needed assistance to Ukraine, has only strengthened, the Department of Defense said. In a press release, the White House said the new measures were designed to disrupt Russian financial institutions, officials and authorities from illegitimately operating in Ukraine. It comes 4 days after US President Joe Biden made a surprise visit to Kiev, where he held talks with his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky. In its latest round of aid, the US government is providing Ukraine with new drone systems, high-mobility rocket systems, ammunition for artillery systems, and communications gear. Earlier this week, the US said China was considering supplying lethal weapons to Russia. They also claimed Chinese firms had already been supplying non-lethal dual-use technology items, which could have both civilian and military uses, such as drones and semiconductors. China has strongly denied the allegations. A meeting of G7 leaders was held on Friday, where they created an enforced team designed to stop Russia from finding sanctions loopholes. G7 countries will continue to keep Russia's sovereign assets immobilized until there is a resolution to the conflict, the group said in a press release. The G7 Group of Seven is an organization of the world's 7 largest advanced economies. They are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the United States. It has so far committed $39 billion to Ukraine's war efforts for 2023. The US said G7 countries and allies would also impose sanctions on key economic sectors in Russia, including its metals and mining sector. Our actions today with our G7 partners show that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said. The US added that it would provide Ukraine with electrical grid equipment to protect its energy supply from Russian strikes, and with generators to provide backup power. The White House will provide Moldova, which borders Ukraine and heavily relies on Russian gas, with $300 million to help increase its local power generation. Moldova is Europe's poorest country and has been heavily impacted by the war. Its leaders have warned for several weeks that Russia is plotting to seize power. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said he plans to meet China's leader Xi Jinping to discuss Beijing's proposals and ending the war in Ukraine. Speaking on the first anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, he said the proposal signaled that China was involved in the search for peace. I really want to believe that China will not supply weapons to Russia, he said. China's plan calls for peace talks and respect for national sovereignty. However, the 12-point document does not specifically say that Russia must withdraw its troops from Ukraine, and it also condemns the usage of unilateral sanctions in what is seen as a veiled criticism of Ukraine's allies in the West. The Chinese authorities have so far not publicly responded to Mr. Zelensky's call for a summit with Mr. Xi. Meanwhile, Russia hailed the Chinese peace proposals. We share Beijing's views, the foreign ministry in Moscow said in a statement. Earlier this week, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Beijing was considering supplying weapons and ammunition to Russia, a claim strongly denied by Beijing. On Friday, American media again reported that the Chinese government was considering sending drones and artillery shells to Moscow. Asked about the Chinese plans, US President Joe Biden told ABC News on Friday, Russian President Vladimir Putin's applauding it, so how could it be any good? I've seen nothing in the plan that would indicate that there is something that would be beneficial to anyone other than Russia. He added, China appears to be siding with Russia, though it would like to find a way of rescuing President Putin by arranging some kind of face-saving peace deal, says the BBC World Affairs editor John Simpson. The Chinese proposals follow a visit by the country's top diplomat Wang Yi to Moscow, where he met President Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Wednesday. After the talks, Mr. Wang was quoted by China's state-run Xinjiang news agency as saying that Beijing was willing to deepen political trust and strengthen strategic coordination with Moscow. Western officials gave the latest proposals a lukewarm reception. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said Beijing doesn't have much credibility because it had not been able to condemn the illegal invasion of Ukraine. President Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, and Russian troops made significant advances during the first few days in Ukraine's north, east and south. But the attack on the capital, Kiev, was soon repulsed, and the Ukrainian military was later able to retake large areas. The conflict, the biggest in Europe since World War II, has since become a grinding war of attrition. At a lengthy news conference in Kiev on Friday, Mr. Zelensky also said victory will inevitably await us if allies respect their promises and deadlines. civilians. Poland said it had already delivered 4 German-made Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine and was ready to deliver more. Germany has said it will provide 14 Leopard tanks, with Spain and Canada also sending tanks. The US, by far the biggest provider of military aid to Ukraine, has pledged to send 31 of its M1 Abrams tanks, and the UK is providing 14 Challenger 2 tanks. The Ukrainian leader added that his country had failed to engage sufficiently with countries in Africa and Latin America after many nations in those continents abstained during a UN General Assembly vote on a resolution condemning Russia's invasion. "We didn't work well for many years, we didn't pay attention. I think it's a big mistake," he said. Asked if he could name his worst moment of the war so far, Mr. Zelensky said Bucha, a town outside Kiev, where Russian troops are accused of having killed civilians in the early part of the war. The small town has been under Russian control until Ukrainian troops fought back last April to reclaim it. "What I saw, it was horrible," Mr. Zelensky said, visibly moved. The US marked a year since Russia invaded Ukraine by announcing a new range of sanctions against Russia and new aid for Ukraine. The latest restrictions target more than 100 entities, both within Russia and worldwide, including banks and suppliers of defense equipment. The US said it wanted to stop those helping Russia exploit loopholes to get sanctioned materials. The White House's fresh round aid for Ukraine is worth $12 billion, or £10 billion, comprising $2 billion from the Department of Defense, including ammunition and drones, and $10 billion from the US State Department, including budgetary support to the Ukrainian government. A further $550 million will be supplied to both Ukraine and neighbouring Moldova to strengthen their energy infrastructure. Moldova is Europe's poorest country and has been heavily impacted by the war. Its leaders have warned for several weeks that Russia is plotting to seize power. Comes days after US President Joe Biden flew to Kiev for a surprise visit and held talks with Mr. Zelensky. On Friday, the EU also approved its 10th round of sanctions against Russia, imposing restrictions on technology that has civilian and military dual use. China has ditched zero COVID, but remnants of the policy are still everywhere, from sprawling temporary hospitals and empty testing booths to posters of QR codes that ask for your travel history. Streets and malls are busy again after officials announced the end of the current wave, sparked by the sudden reversal of 3-year-long restrictions. There is no public record of how much China invested in what became a signature policy of leader Xi Jinping, but according to a Reuters estimate last year, Beijing was on track to spend more than 350 billion yen, or $52 billion, on COVID testing, new medical facilities, monitoring equipment, and other anti-COVID measures in 2022. And now much of that infrastructure is being dismantled or repurposed, or at least that's what officials are trying to do. In Shandong province, they recently turned a makeshift hospital, which appears to be built from metal containers, into a rental space. It offers discounted apartments to skilled talents, although it's unclear who qualifies for this. This is despite local media reporting in only December, just before zero COVID was dropped, that Shandong's local government was planning to spend 23 billion yen on building makeshift hospitals. This particular 605-room facility, located in the provincial capital Jinan, was being used as a quarantine centre. One tenant who works at a car maker nearby told Jinan Daily that he literally moved in with a suitcase, adding it was very convenient as his workplace was just across the street. The government has portrayed this as a cost-saving win. Many people commenting online support it too, suggesting it as a housing option for migrant workers. Others, however, question how comfortable this square cabin would be in winter, especially as it was built within a month last year. I suggest the person who came up with the idea go and live in the square cabin, one user on Weibo mocked. On Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, a top light comment read, "This will surely scare the talents away." But that's not all that remains as an inescapable reminder of life under zero COVID. Testing booths, both mobile and stationary, have been a common sight across the country, located in every neighbourhood. They played an essential role in implementing zero COVID. Now some of those booths are up for sale from 500 to 8,000 yen on second-hand trading platforms. Many more are still on the streets, sitting empty and no longer in use. Queues at these sites were common at the peak of restrictions, as some places required people to test every day. Often people have to have negative results for permission to use the bus or to buy groceries. Tape and barricades also frequently seen to section off parts of streets for testing booths, queues or other COVID-related measures. Many of these remain visible too. While most testing requirements are gone, bright red posters asking people to scan the QR codes can still be spotted everywhere. Under zero COVID, anyone entering shops or restaurants was required to scan these codes, which revealed their travel history, whether or not they had COVID or whether they had been in contact with someone who had tested positive. In some cases, these signs are stuck onto restaurants and shop fronts that have long shut. Zero COVID hit China's economy hard, strangling supply chains and shutting businesses from economic hub Shanghai to rural towns. But the one thing that is no longer visible is the hundreds of thousands of workers in white hazmat suits who carried out Beijing's zero zero-COVID edicts. There has never been an official tally of their number, and it seems like authorities have been given little guidance on where they could work next. Stopping school inspections in England would be against children's best interests, Ofsted's chief has said. Teachers have called for them to be paused after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life while waiting for a report that downgraded her school from outstanding to inadequate. Amanda Spielman said inspections are important for both schools and parents. It comes as the BBC can reveal Miss Perry had been delighted with feedback from Ofsted in an informal visit in 2019. Inspectors had visited Caversham Primary School as part of a programme of informal visits to pilot a new inspection framework. Ofsted has confirmed to the BBC's education editor, Branwen Jeffries, that Miss Spielman attended in person to observe the visit. In a newsletter to parents at the time, Miss Perry said she was incredibly proud of how well pupils and staff responded to the experience, adding that the feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. But after a formal inspection in November 2022, Miss Perry's school was rated as inadequate as a result of failings in training, record keeping and checks on staff. The Ofsted report added that Caversham Primary School provided a good education and a welcoming and vibrant community for children. Following Miss Perry's death, Miss Spielman has said a debate about reforming inspections to remove grades was a legitimate one, but added that any changes to the system would have to meet the needs both of parents and of government. Ofsted inspectors give ratings of either outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate. Miss Spielman said those ratings give parents a simple and accessible summary of the school's strengths and weaknesses. But Paul Gosling, president of the National Association of Head Teachers, told BBC Radio 4's Today programme the one-word assessments were too simplistic to sum up the complexity of life. Miss Perry's family has said her death was a direct result of the pressure caused by the school inspection. Lisa Telling, a head teacher in Reading who knew Miss Perry well, said she had been under enormous stress and knew the outcome of her report, but was unable to tell her staff. As a head teacher, when you get your results and your final feedback, currently the system does not allow you to share that. That's a huge piece of information to hold on to. Ofsted's handbook says school leaders can share the provisional findings of inspections with those responsible for the governance of the school, as long as they are marked as confidential and subject to change. Miss Telling told BBC Breakfast that Miss Perry was restricted from sharing the world-destroying verdict for 54 days before she died. Mr. Costing said school leaders should be allowed to speak to a range of people who might be able to support them if they were concerned by an Ofsted result. Since Miss Perry's death, some head teachers have removed references to Ofsted from websites, job adverts and letters. And on Thursday, the National Education Union handed a petition to the government calling for Ofsted to be replaced. In Reading, head teachers group have written to the government asking for an urgent review of the system. Miss Spielman said it would be wrong to say too much ahead of the coroner's inquest. Our school inspectors are all former or serving school leaders, she added. They understand the vital work head teachers do and the pressures they are under. Miss Spielman acknowledged inspections can be challenging, but said inspectors always aimed to conduct them with sensitivity as well as professionalism. But school improvement advisor Julie Price-Grimshaw said that was definitely not the case. Speaking to BBC 5 Live Breakfast, she said many head teachers were getting very ill, stressed and having breakdowns as a result of inspections. Miss Price-Grimshaw, who used to be an Ofsted inspector, said it was impossible for teachers and head teachers to raise standards if they're feeling broken, demoralised, stressed and anxious. But one vice principal at a secondary school in West Yorkshire said Ofsted inspectors came across as human and had collaborative conversations with staff during a recent visit. He said the inspection process was intense and extremely stressful, but added that it resulted in an honest reflection of where our school is at. Miss Spielman said Ofsted aimed to make inspections as collaborative and constructive as we can and would remain focused on improving how it worked with schools and how inspections feel for school staff. She admitted it was a difficult time to be a head teacher, particularly since the pandemic, as absence was high, mental health problems had increased and external support services are unable to meet increased demands. Scotland is one of the first countries in the world to stump up cash for loss and damage caused by climate change in poorer countries. When torrential rains came to the village of Mambuntung in Malawi, people's homes were washed away, but that was not the worst of it. The floodwaters were infested with crocodiles, children were carried away by them, it was terrifying. Eventually in 2015, the villagers couldn't take anymore and moved their entire community to higher ground. Then the new village began to flood too. Malawi in southern Africa has been hit hard by the effects of climate change, but it's one of the poorest countries in the world and struggles to pay for measures needed to repair the damage. That's where the Scottish Government has stepped in, promoting the notion that rich nations should help pay for the damage from climate change in less developed countries. At the COP26 Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, it committed £2 million for a loss and damage scheme, a world first. A further £5 million is promised from April. In November at COP27 in Egypt, other world leaders finally agreed they would follow that example. In Mambungdungo, some of the money is being used to create flood defences in the new settlement uphill. Village Chief Isaac Mamandugu said he had no choice but to lead his people to safer ground. He said people tried to build good houses, but the water destroyed them. Even our children were carried away by the water. Even the crocodiles that are found in the river would come and attack the people. So when we saw this, we decided to move higher grounds. However, the move has not been popular with everyone. Dorike Mitiyashi has already returned to the original village because the farmland is more fertile. She said the new settlement was affected by the same flooding as they had run away from. So what do we do? She asked. It is estimated about 80% of people in Malawi live and work off the land, and the southern region is a patchwork of small plots, mainly growing maize. It is an existence of extreme poverty, with many rural communities having no access to electricity and 3.8 million people at risk of food insecurity, according to the World Food Programme. The Scottish Government's money is being spent in Malawi by organisations such as SCAIF, the Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund. It identified 6 villages where the impacts from climate change have been significant. Some of the 500,000 SCAIF has been allocated is being spent rebuilding the Mapatso preschool in Nadagu, which was originally constructed by the Roger Federer Foundation and Action Aid. When the rains came from Tropical Storm Anna and Cyclone Gome in early 2022, the buildings were lost and teaching was halted as the school was turned into a makeshift camp for the thousands whose homes were lost. Teacher Hannah Souza says those from the lower grounds running away from the water came to camp here and they disturbed the learning process. We were unable to run our school because of the people that had come to camp here. Teaching was very difficult. That's the challenge we faced. The school's kitchens were destroyed and the children have been having to eat their breakfast porridge on the ground using trees for shade. But the loss and damage cash is now being used to rebuild those parts of the school which were destroyed. Ben Wilson, advocacy manager at SCAIF, says the money is different from the type of humanitarian aid which follows a major disaster. He says often that aid and those aid workers then leave because they can go on to the next disaster, and there always is a next disaster. This money is coming in at a later stage when the communities have already received that immediate support, but it's giving them what they need to build back, to build that resilience, but also to get their lives back on track. Some of the money is being used to protect a cemetery in the village of Mirbenje, where graves are frequently lifted and carried off by floodwaters. Village leaders had to ask neighbouring communities for space in their graveyards to bury the dead. Saturated ground means it is a long time after the floods have gone before they are able to dig again. Group village head Lucy Bangta Mirbenje says when the water comes, the tombstones are underwater. Even when the water has receded and we have a funeral, just by digging a little bit, the water level is so high. That's why we go ask for other graveyards, because we can't bury the dead in the water, she says. The climate has really changed. If we talk about past flooding, our graveyard was not affected. There was no water in our graveyard. 2 teenage boys aged 14 and 16 have appeared in court, charged with the murder of a 16-year-old who was stabbed to death in Northampton. Rohan Shand, known to his family and friends as Fred, died in Kingsthorpe at about 3:35 p.m. on Wednesday. The 2 teenagers, who cannot be named for legal reasons, appeared at Northampton Magistrates Court. They were remanded in youth detention accommodation and will next appear at Northampton Crown Court on Monday. A 49-year-old man and a 21-year-old man who were arrested in connection with Rohan's death have both been released with no further action, Northamptonshire police said. The boy's family was said to be devastated at his death, which happened on Harborough Road, close to the junction with the Cock Hotel. A post-mortem examination indicated the teenager died from a single stab wound to the chest. Northamptonshire police said specially trained officers were supporting the boy's family. Officers have said they would still like to speak to witnesses, anyone with information or anyone with CCTV, doorbell or dash cam footage of the area at time. Helen Freeman, who lives in Kingsthorpe, said her son had been friends with Mr. Shand and described him as funny and very popular. It's devastating to see your child so upset. I don't think I've seen my son cry as much as he did last night, but his friends have been there for him. An online appeal to raise money towards the funeral has already collected more than £19,000. People from ethnic minority backgrounds are no longer significantly more likely to die from COVID-19, new Office for National Statistics ONS data shows. Analysts looked at mortality rates for different ethnic communities between January and November 2022, when Omicron was the dominant COVID variant. Early in the pandemic, deaths involving coronavirus were higher among Black and Asian people than white people. The highest risk was among Bangladeshi, Black Caribbean and Pakistani groups. COVID mortality rates for all ethnic minorities decreased last year. The latest data shows there is no significant statistical difference between the number of COVID deaths among ethnic minorities and the white population. The ONS also said that all cause mortality rates, measuring how likely people are to die of any cause, including COVID-19, have returned to pre-pandemic levels. The reasons for this change are are complex, and experts say there are various factors to consider. Dr. Vina Rayleigh, an epidemiologist and senior fellow at the King's Fund, told the BBC that at the start of the pandemic, we knew very little about COVID-19, how it transmitted, and how to mitigate its spread and impact. The virus had its greatest impact on people who were most vulnerable or exposed to the infection. That was older people and people working in frontline jobs, key workers in the NHS, public transport, and of course ethnic minorities are disproportionately working in these roles. Initially, the virus had a terrible impact in terms of mortality, but over time we learned more about how this virus transmits. For example, various social measures to control the spread of infection were introduced, like mask wearing and social distancing, so that helped to moderate ethnic differences. And then of course the vaccination program came in, and although vaccination rates are lower in some ethnic minority groups, nonetheless a significant proportion of the population is vaccinated or has some immunity because they have been exposed to the virus. All of these factors have contributed to reducing ethnic differences in COVID-19 mortality over time. Mortality rates are also lower in general with Omicron in contrast to other variants. A previous study from the ONS published in the British Medical Journal last June compared deaths from Omicron BA.1 with another variant Delta. It found that the risk of dying from COVID-19 was 66% lower for those who contracted Omicron than it was for patients who contracted Delta. A spokesperson for the think tank Runnymede told the BBC COVID-19 was not just a health crisis, it was also a social and economic crisis. Unequal health outcomes are not confined to COVID-19, and long-standing racial and economic inequality is at the heart of understanding the pandemic. It is precisely because these inequalities are so systematic and interlinked that when crisis hit, certain communities were impacted first, the hardest, and in multiple ways. One person has died in a listeria outbreak, and people have been warned to avoid Baronet semi-soft cheeses, which were recalled as they were contaminated with a related strain of bacteria. The Food Standards Agency, FSA, has warned people not to eat the cheeses due to them containing exceptionally high levels of the bacteria. The FSA has not confirmed Baronet, which makes the cheeses, is the source. The Old Cheese Room in Wiltshire said it was working closely with the FSA. There have been 3 cases of listeria linked to the outbreak, resulting in the death of 1 person, the FSA confirmed. Several batches of Baronet, Baby Baronet, and Mini Baronet soft cheeses made by the Old Cheese Room have been recalled. The agency is continuing to investigate whether the person who died had eaten Baronet cheese. Cases were identified in the south of England and London, but the product is distributed nationally. Tim Potter, the FSA's head of incidents, said a closely genetically related strain of Listeria monocytogenes found in samples of Baronet cheese was found in all 3 cases in this outbreak. However, that does not necessarily mean that all those involved in the outbreak contracted listeriosis as a result of eating Baronet cheese. Although a source of Listeria has been found in cheese products, work to ascertain the cause of the outbreak is continuing. The agency said the outbreak strain has also been found in some food products and samples taken from other places where the cheese has been sold, supplied and served from. The bacteria can cause listeriosis, a rare infection that usually goes away on its own, but can have serious complications including causing meningitis. Symptoms can be similar to flu and include a high temperature, muscle aches or pain, chills, feeling of being sick and diarrhea. The Old Cheese Room said that none of its other cheeses have been affected by the outbreak. As a responsible cheese maker, we carry out regular cleaning, disinfecting and swab testing of our making and ripening rooms, they said in a statement. Since the tests that showed a trace of Listeria monocytogenes in a single batch of Baronet, we have changed our monthly testing regime to positive release. This means that we test every batch of cheese before it leaves us. None of our other cheeses have been affected by this. Miss Potter said vulnerable people should be particularly concerned with following the product recall advice, including pregnant women and the elderly. Richard Elson, head of incidents and response at the UK Health Security Agency, said listeriosis is a rare infection and most people will only experience mild symptoms such as abdominal pain or diarrhea, which usually pass within a few days without the need for treatment. But people with weakened immune systems who are pregnant or are infants or elderly are at greater risk of developing severe symptoms. Jeremy Hunt insists his budget will get young parents and over 50s back into work, and it will not just benefit the rich who are saving for retirement. The Chancellor told the BBC he wants to fill 1 million vacancies across the UK so firms can grow faster. He plans to expand free childcare in England and scrap the £1 million cap for tax-free pension savings. Labour has said it will reverse the pension move if elected, calling it a tax cut for the top 1%. It was the wrong priority at the wrong time, said Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Labour has said it would target the pensions tax cut at NHS doctors if it wins power. In this budget speech, Mr Hunt claimed the UK economy would avoid a recession, with inflation predicted to more than half by the end of this year. But he said a shortage of workers was holding back growth, and he wanted more over 50s, people with disabilities and parents of young children to get back to work. Offering eligible workers working parents with children as young as 9 months. In England, 30 hours of free childcare is a key part of the plan, but it will not be introduced fully until September 2025. Mr Hunt said he would like to have extended childcare help sooner, but it first needed a big increase in the number of childminders and nurseries, as well as scrapping the £1 million cap on the amount people can save for their pensions before it is taxed extra. He increased the annual tax-free allowance on pensions from £40,000 to £60,000. The changes aim to encourage senior teachers and doctors to keep working. Asked about criticism that it was a budget for the rich, allowing people who are already well off to save more money for their pensions, he said, well, of course, we want to help older people who want to stay and work. By definition, they will generally be on higher salaries, but nearly 5 times more help is going to young parents to help them with childcare costs, a nearly 6% reduction in childcare costs of £6,500 per child. That will make a huge difference to families, but also it will make a huge difference to businesses who worry, particularly smaller businesses, that they are losing valuable employees when they start a family. The government's independent forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, says the Chancellor's policies are likely to add about 110,000 people to the UK workforce, depending on how they react to the various incentives. Asked why after 13 years of Conservative government, a whole generation is not doing as well as their parents had, Mr Hunt said his growth plan meant better jobs and better opportunities. We had 500,000 people who left the labour force during the lockdowns, he added. That's an effect you haven't seen in any other country, and that's why I've announced the measures I've announced today to encourage people back to work. One senior government figure described it as steady as she goes budget after the turbulence of Liz Truss's short-lived premiership. The OBR said the UK economy would shrink by 0.2% this year, which is better than previously forecast and does not technically count as a recession. Inflation is forecast to fall from 10.7% in the final quarter of last year to 2.9% by the end of 2023. Living standards are still expected to fall by the largest amount since records began, according to the OBR, but the decline will not be as bad as it had forecast in November. The economy is predicted to return to growth, but house prices are projected to fall by 10% by 2025. The OBR also highlighted Rishi Sunak's April 2021 decision when he was Chancellor to freeze tax thresholds, which is said amounted to the equivalent of a 4p increase in the basic rate of income tax. That move, dubbed a stealth tax by critics, is due to come into effect next month and will increase government income by £29.3 billion a year. Speaking to BBC Breakfast on Thursday morning, Mr Hunt admitted for a while the tax burden will be higher due to costs incurred during the pandemic and on subsidising energy costs. These things have to be paid for, he said, adding, it's the right thing to do to get through this difficult period. He said the government wants to cut taxes when we can. Preston-wide childcare reforms will take years to roll out. He described the changes as the biggest in my lifetime and said the sector needs time to adjust to a new surge in demand. He also defended the decision to remove the lifetime allowance on pension pots as a measure which will help the NHS retain doctors who otherwise might opt for early retirement or to cut their hours. Labour's Rachel Reeves said the policy is a tax giveaway for the top 1% and should have been targeted at the health sector rather than applied more broadly. Some Tory MPs were disappointed by the decision to go ahead with a planned rise to corporation tax next month. However, Mr Hunt said that businesses would be able to deduct money they invest in IT equipment and machinery from their taxable profits for the next 3 years. There was no announcement in this budget for extra money for public sector pay, as a wave of strikes by workers, including junior doctors, teachers and rail staff, continues. In his speech, Mr Hunt also pledged an expansion in wraparound care at the start and finish of the school day for parents with older children and changes to staff to child ratios in England to expand supply of childcare, although the target date for the measure was September 2026. And he announced plans to abolish work capability assessments, which he said would be separate benefit entitlement from an individual's ability to work. From 2026, the government will use another test currently used to assess eligibility for personal independence payments, the main disability benefit, to decide if someone is eligible for additional payments. Other measures unveiled in the budget include extending support for energy bills at current levels for a further 3 months, bringing charges for people with prepayment meters in line with those for public direct debit customers, saving them £45 a year on their energy bills from July, raising tax on alcohol by 10.1% from the 1st of August, freezing duty charged on drought beers to help the Great British Pub, raising tax on tobacco by 2% above inflation. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said after 13 years of this government, our economy needed major surgery, but like millions across our country, this budget leaves us stuck in the waiting room with only a sticking plaster to hand. A country set on a path of managed decline, falling behind our competitors, the sixth man of Europe once again. S&P economy spokesman Stuart Hosey said it's truly pathetic that the Chancellor has failed to cut energy bills, despite having ample resources to do so. Liberal Democrat leader Sir Ed Davey said Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak had a chance to show they care about the cost of living crisis that's hitting millions of Britain's families and pensioners, but they failed miserably. Retail consultant Mary Portas has written an open letter to John Lewis warning that the department store had let go of its soul. The brand expert described the UK retail giant as part of our collective cultural identity. Her comments come after John Lewis revealed it was considering a change to its employee-owned business structure, so altering decades of tradition. Chair Sharon White said she wanted the brand to thrive for generations. Miss Porter's intervention is via an open letter on the networking website LinkedIn, addressed to Miss White and John Lewis' new Chief Executive Nish Kankiwala. You are custodians of one of the most valued, loved and trusted retail brands this country has, the retail consultant wrote. She said John Lewis and its supermarket chain Waitrose were part of the fabric of everyday British life. Earlier this month, the department store signalled job cuts were in the pipeline after it cancelled its staff bonus and reported pre-tax losses of £234 million in what it said was a very tough operating year. If the group pursues the idea of selling a minority stake in the business, it will end it being exclusively owned by its employees. But Miss Porter said, your task isn't to turn around just another mediocre retailer under threat of going under. You're fighting to save part of our collective cultural identity. But what's worrying me is that you think your fight is purely financial. It's not. Describing the battle as more nuanced, Miss Porter said what laid ahead was about the soul of your brand. Somehow in recent years you've let go of the soul. Her letter said, what we want is to come to you when we're expecting our first baby and panicking about buying a cot. When we finally made it onto the property ladder and want curtains and a sofa bed that'll last. But she warned that was being slowly chipped away from loud headlines to daily whispers. Miss Porter said she appreciated the partnership needed money men, but added, never forget to balance all that with the commercially instinctive, reactive, creative, retail-born folk in the business. It's an art, not a science. She urged the group to recommit to the principles it was founded on, common ownership. We know British brand history is littered with those who tampered with the crown jewels of their identity. British Airways clings on. Rest in peace, Laura Ashley and dear Woolworths. But failure of John Lewis and Waitrose is not an option. We can't lose you too. In response, John Lewis Chair Sharon White said it was the biggest privilege of my life to be a custodian of the partnership. I'm here to ensure that it not only survives but thrives for generations. Miss White said 100 million customers visited its department stores last year, a third up on the previous year, and 500 million customers visited the app and website. We want our brands to continue to grow, she said. We've always been open to new partnerships with investors or like-minded companies to share in our growth. I will not rest until the partnership is restored to full health. Far-right groups have been stoking tensions in UK towns by posting inflammatory leaflets through people's doors and staging anti-migrant rallies. In one town in South Wales, a local community has banded together and is planning a peaceful counter-protest. Annie, aged 73, has lived in Llantwit Mayor on the south coast of Wales for more than 50 years. She lives in an old church building, loves guerrilla gardening, and coordinates a seed swap with other gardening enthusiasts in her community. She has seen her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren grow up in the town, and now she is one of the unlikely ringleaders of a local pushback against a national far-right group that is targeting Llantwit Major. It is not a fight Annie pictured herself taking on. Patriotic Alternative has been staging anti-migrant protests across the UK and leafleting communities where there are existing tensions about the provision of accommodation for asylum seekers. It started leafleting Llantwit Major in February, soon after Vale of Glamorgan Council announced that temporary houses for refugees were going to be built on the site of a closed-down primary school. The leaflets promoted a protest against the development on the 25th of March and read, Llantwit says no to a migrant camp and no more migrants, Wales is full. Like many in the town, Annie had never heard of Patriotic Alternative, but she started to feel their influence. Debates on the local Facebook group became increasingly heated. Friendly small talk in cafes and on the street quickly turned into anxious conversations. On the 21st of February, the town's football club posted a statement on social media saying racism, xenophobia and discrimination have no place in Llantwit. Shortly afterwards, the Cardiff branch of the National Anti-Racism Organisation came to Llantwit Major, meeting people who were worried and promising to coordinate a response. Then there was radio silence. I just thought, this is ridiculous. Let's just get on with it. What's stopping us? Another Llantwit resident, Ryan, whose name has been changed, told BBC News. Ryan created a new WhatsApp group chat made up of anyone she thought might be worried, including the head of the knitting club, the football club's match day DJ and town's punk-turned-priest, Father Edwin Counsell. Like most people in the group, Jack, the football club DJ, who also works at his family's cafe, told BBC News that he doesn't have a background in political activism, but he felt protective of his community and the misfits that live there. Llantwit is overwhelmingly a very positive, friendly town where weirdos and eccentrics are welcome. The group said the idea of a full-blown counter-protest felt intimidating. They didn't want to inadvertently invite agitators of any political background. In the end, they felt the best way to challenge the group was with non-violent resistance, the spirit of welcome, FR Council told BBC News. The day will kick off with an overnight vigil at the church the night before, followed by a Welsh cake giveaway during the day. Another church will also open a space during the day for anyone feeling anxious about patriotic alternative. Welsh cakes are a symbol of hospitality, so if you meet a far-right neo-fascist bonehead who looks out of a place there, the critical question you must ask that person is, would you like a Welsh cake? It has been branded a day of kindness. Do I want to welcome these people in Llanwit? FR Council said. To tell you the truth, I don't. I want them to go away and let us get on with sorting out a local issue. But if they are going to come, then I hope they see something in our welcome. There is, however, undeniable tension in the town. Annie said she is occasionally being challenged whilst handing out leaflets for the Day of Kindness. One man spoke to her at length about how much he hated Islamics. Another woman told her she just bought and renovated a house near the site of the development, and that while she was happy for Ukrainians to be housed there, if anyone else comes, I'm moving. But the issue is not black and white, and for many in the town, their opinions sit in a grey area. Some generally approve of the rehousing of asylum seekers, but disagree with how the plans are being carried out. Annie, for example, said she agrees with the principle, but worries that those in the new houses will be segregated from the rest of the town. Others worry that a sudden increase in population could put a strain on local services. One woman responding to the council's announcement on Facebook wrote that Llanwit is a small town which is already growing too fast for it to cope. Now we have this. In particular, a number of people hoped the site was going to be used to build a new health centre, which those behind the Day of Kindness said they understood and sympathised with. But this is also something Patriotic Alternative has directly seized on in its posts targeting the town, with slogans such as "Where's the medical centre?" Llanwit Major is not a single case. Patriotic Alternative has targeted other towns in the UK, often where there are hotels used as temporary accommodation for asylum seekers. In North Rotherham, leaflets warned residents of white genocide. The group has made several visits to Skegness, where tensions are already high around the occupation of hotels, which some residents feel would otherwise be used by holidaymakers. A demonstration outside a hotel in Kirkby, Merseyside in February made news headlines when it descended into disorder. Patriotic Alternative has a significant reach online. The Centre for Countering Digital Hate, CCDH, told BBC News. Analysis from CCDH found that tweets posted by Patriotic Alternatives founder Mark Collett were collectively viewed more than 10.6 million times before he and the group were suspended from Twitter on the 23rd of February. Now the group primarily shares content on less mainstream platforms. Smaller social media platforms out of the glare of intense scrutiny are incredibly dangerous breeding grounds for extremism. Callum Hood, head of research at the CCDH, told BBC News. Councillors, community leaders and groups which work with refugees in the affected areas have told BBC News that hotels are often in inappropriate locations and local communities, and councillors are only involved at the last minute, if at all. In Knowsley, the council said it had been given 48 hours notice before the hotel was used to house asylum seekers. And in Llanwit, even those who are positive about the housing development believe it was sprung upon the community without much notice. Vale of Glamorgan Council has said it only got permission to build the houses in December. The Home Office told BBC News it will continue to engage with local authorities as early as possible, whenever sites are used for asylum accommodation, and work to ensure arrangements are safe for hotel residents and local people. Tim Squirrel from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, ISD, told BBC News that it is exactly these kinds of wedge issues in local areas that are exploited by the group to boost their profile and gain recruits. Patriotic Alternatives sees concerns around immigration and asylum as winning issues that will gain them local support and allow them to introduce people to their more overtly extreme beliefs. On its website, Patriotic Alternatives describes itself as community building and activism group, and campaigns about what it claims are issues such as the demographic decline of native Britons in the United Kingdom and the environmental impact of mass immigration and the indoctrination and political bias taking place in British schools. For Annie, thinking about the prospect of a far-right group coming to her town makes her feel scared, anxious and horrified, but at the same time she says she is amazed at how solidly everyone is behind us. Jack agreed. Despite the flyers, he said most people didn't want the protest to happen. What you generally find is how diplomatic it is here. People actually listen to each other, consider things and find compromises. Even for most of those who are concerned about the housing development, he said they're like, yeah, but we don't want neo-Nazis here. Comedian Rosie Jones seems to be everywhere these days, from Casualty to QI. But as she prepares to begin her first solo stand-up tour, she is also battling against her own feelings that she doesn't belong. I'm excited about the tour, Rosie says, with just a few days to go. I'm a little bit scared, but I'm excited to go out and meet people. At just 32, Rosie seems to have achieved everything when it comes to media, acting in long-running dramas, publishing several children's books, and writing for the Netflix hit Sex Education. She also fronted Trip Hazard, her own travel show, appeared on Live at the Apollo, and got all political on Question Time. But she says people are surprised to learn that she hasn't toured before. I've really only been doing comedy for 6 years, and 2 of those were wiped out by the pandemic, she tells Access All, the BBC's weekly disability and mental health podcast. Her tour, Triple Threat, will examine the ideas of dealing with new fame and whether she actually deserves it, a topic which she sees as an art mimicking life. Starting on the 3rd of March, she has 35 fully accessible venues booked with many performances, including British Sign Language interpretation. She knows she can't be seen to drop the ball on this. I was absolutely determined to make sure every room was accessible, she says, aware the disabled community would be particularly critical of her if she messed up. My production company had to ring up every venue and say, what can you do? And any venue that said, we can't do that, they said Rosie won't go. Although she is excited about her tour, she feels nervous. Being a person who is disabled, she explains about bringing on imposter syndrome. I go in thinking of the comedian stereotype, which I grew up with, which was male, non-disabled, straight, loud, and talking really quickly. When you come to see me, you don't get fast-paced jokes, but I guarantee you laugh a lot. Rosie has cerebral palsy. It affects her speech and walk, and she says she's constantly fighting internalized ableism. Ableism is discrimination that favors non-disabled people above disabled people. Internalized ableism, a phrase we're hearing a lot more of, especially on social media, is when a disabled person absorbs the discrimination they face and think that way about themselves too. Being a woman means that every time I'm on TV, I'll get a comment about what I sound like, my disability, my weight, my teeth, my hair, so every single level is a way to abuse me. Because of that, I'm in therapy. I'm really dealing with a lot of internalized ableism and things that I probably painted over with a joke. Trolling and ableism are on her mind at the moment. As well as preparing for her tour, she's filming a Channel 4 documentary about society's attitudes towards disabled people, which is due to be aired in May. She says, every single day I get some form of ableism online or in real life, and I think in order to eradicate that, in order to face the abusers, I've got to come here and go, you know what, it's not okay. We absolutely need to call ableism out in order to eradicate it. When Rosie appeared twice on BBC One's flagship debate show, Question Time, social media lit up with seriously unpleasant comments about her which made headlines. Both times I started trending on Twitter from all the abuse I was getting, she says. They were saying that I should be in a cage, I shouldn't be on TV, I should die. Stars like TV presenter and author Richard Osman, who himself is visually impaired, came out in support, and it prompted a national debate about the way society view disability. BBC reporter Alex Taylor summarised it at the time, saying society is used to disability being discussed, but not so much disabled people making their own voices heard. It has been 2 years since Rosie's last appearance on the late night politics show, and she has had time to reflect. I think Question Time is brilliant, but it attracts a lot of angry people, and not only being female, disabled, I'm also, surprise surprise, extremely Labour leaning. So when I went onto that show and said, here's what I think, a lot of right-wing people didn't agree with me, and the easy thing to go for was my disability. Would I do it again? Yes, but I would go in there more prepared, and I'd probably shut my Twitter down for a few weeks. The experience rocked her, but she says speaking out for what she believes in is more important. I will always champion diversity, but it's hard and it's exhausting when I expose myself to so much abuse. Despite that experience, Rosie's career has continued to rise. Her series of children's books about the amazing Eddie Eckhard, who has cerebral palsy, has brought her legions of young fans, and she is currently the go-to girl when it comes to booking a female disabled comedian. Selfishly, I like that because it's brought me a lovely house, she jokes, but I don't think I'm taking jobs from other disabled people. We're still, unfortunately, at a stage where they're getting either me or another white, straight, non-disabled person. She says appearing on as many different shows as possible might encourage more disabled people to come into the industry. Her ultimate dream is to appear on a panel show which happens to feature several other disabled comics at the same time. It's something she got close to recently when she fronted Rosie Jones' Disability Comedy Extravaganza, an online event showcasing 10 disabled up-and-coming comedians for UK TV Play and Dave TV's YouTube channel. One of the comedians who performed was Dan Tiernan, who talks about being dyspraxic in his stand-up routine. He's gone on to win both the BBC New Comedy Award and British Comedian of the Year, demonstrating the strength and mainstream appeal of the acts. Rosie appreciates that with her recently found success, she can help to change the industry. I've got this platform and it's about how we bring up a load of different disabled comics with me, she says. As Rosie gets ready to head to Birmingham for opening night, she acknowledges, I'm really proud of myself. Just like a rock star, she has a non-negotiable rider that she expects to be provided at every venue. This is the most embarrassing thing. I wish I was a packet of cigarettes and bottle of whiskey, gal, but it's just a bit of Yorkshire tea. Dozens of hot air balloons are set to soar above London's skyline later this year for the first time since 2020. The London Mayor's hot air balloon regatta will return to the capital after being cancelled in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and in 2021 and 2022 because of bad weather. The timings would depend on the weather, with 14th and 21st of May the first two possible dates, organisers said. A third standby date of the 2nd of July has also been agreed, they added. The last time the regatta took place was in 2019, when 46 hot air balloons took off from Battersea Park at 5:30 am and floated through the skies place across central London. That event raised £76,000 for charity, and organisers said that in total the 4 events held since the first in 2015 had so far raised just over £250,000. More details are expected to be confirmed in due course. Children starting secondary school in England and Wales in September 2023 have been offered school places. So what should you do when your options are when you're not happy? Children starting Year 7 in England and Wales in 2023 in September found out about their school places on the 1st of March. In Northern Ireland, emails about post-primary school places are issued on the 20th of May. In Scotland, no offers are made as councils decide where children are placed, and primary school offers will be made in England and Wales on the 17th of April. How do parents and carers accept a school offer? In England and Wales, parents who applied online received an email on the 1st of March with details of how to accept the place and the deadline. Those who did not apply online were sent a letter. If parents do not accept by the date specified, the offer could be withdrawn and the place could be given to someone else. Across London, 3 in 10 children missed out on their first choice of school for September 2023. Figures aren't yet available for the whole of England, but in 2022, 83.3% of applicants were offered a place at their first preference secondary school. That percentage had been broadly static since 2014. How are places decided? Looked after children are given top priority, but beyond that, schools can set their own admissions criteria. Some give priority to children from a particular religion or those who pass an entrance exam. Research from the University of Bristol about how 3,250 secondary schools in England admitted pupils in September 2020 found 96% gave precedence to those whose siblings already attended, 88% were more likely to give places to school children, only 5% prioritised poorer pupils. The Nuffield Foundation charity said prioritising local children reinforces geographic inequalities by excluding those who can't afford to live close to the top performing schools, and urged a fairer approach. What if you did not get the school you wanted? In England, if your child is not offered a place at your preferred school, you are usually offered another school listed on your application. If none of your chosen schools have spaces, your child may be offered a place somewhere else. You can join the waiting list for your preferred schools, and these must remain open for at least the first term of the school year. You can accept a place after being on a waiting list even if your child has already started at another school. In Wales, any child not given a place at their first preference school is added to a waiting list. In Northern Ireland, if your child is not offered a place at any of the schools you wanted, you'll be asked to choose a new preference from a list of schools that still have places. In Scotland, the council decides which school in your local catchment area your child will attend. You can request a place at a school outside the catchment area, and the council must allow this if there is space, but it is not guaranteed. How to appeal against a school admissions decision. You can appeal against the decision no matter where you are in the UK. In England, you can appeal within 20 working days, and the case must be heard within 40 days. The final decision is made by an independent panel at a hearing where the council or school explains why the application was rejected, and the parent makes the case for why their child should be accepted. To appeal successfully, parents must show that the proper admissions process was not followed, or that relevant circumstances about their child were not considered. Parents and carers should be informed of the panel's decision within 5 days. If the appeal is successful, the child will be given a place, but if it is unsuccessful, the child can still be added to the school's waiting list. There were 28,687 appeals, 3.9% of new admissions for the 2021 to 2022 academic year. Of those, 6,055, 21.1% were successful. The percentage of appeals made has not yet changed significantly in recent years, although the proportion which was successful has dropped from 26.3% in 2016. In Wales, parents can challenge the admissions authority's decision during an initial appeal hearing. If the panel does not find in the child's favour at this point, the appeal can move to a second stage where parents set out their argument and the admission authority responds. Parents should have the panel's final decision within 5 days. Can I get help with school transport? Parents and carers across the UK may be able to get free or lower cost transport if their child's allocated school is far away. Applications need to go through the relevant local education authority. What if my child has special educational needs? If your child has special educational needs, in England, their education, health and care plan will specify their school. The school must give the child a place. In Wales, a child's statement of SEN will set out a particular school the local authority thinks is appropriate. And what if you applied after the 31st October deadline? If you applied for a place after the deadline in England and Wales, your application will then not be considered until after the first round of offers are made. This means your child is less likely to get a place at your preferred school. However, your child can still be added to the waiting list of the school you wanted. Malawi's President Lazarus Chakwera says the Scottish Fund for Poor Countries hit by climate change should be appropriate prototype for the whole world. The Scottish Government announced in 2021 that it would begin funding so-called loss and damage projects. After much wrangling, world leaders followed Scotland's lead at last year's UN Climate Summit in Egypt. Mr Chakwera said the small Scottish fund has already made a significant difference in 10 areas. A quarter of the £2 million allocated for this year is being spent in Malawi, which has long established ties with Scotland. A further £5 million is being made available from April. In a BBC interview, Mr Chakwera said it has made huge differences in the people and their livelihoods because they are given a hand up, so the resilience we talk about becomes a practical issue. He added that what Scotland is already doing is what everybody else needs to be doing. Describing the money as aid is wrong, he insisted, saying it should instead be seen as countries taking responsibility for climate change together. Loss and damage refers to the impacts caused by climate change, such as increasing storms and more destructive weather patterns. In Malawi's Zomba region, the Scottish Government money is being used to rebuild parts of a 7-kilometre, 4-mile flood embankment on the Falome River, which was breached by storms last year in 10 places. Further south, new flood defences are being built in the village of Mambundungu, where the village was relocated to higher ground to avoid flooding, but was then hit by a deluge running off the hills. Developing countries have argued for decades that richer nations should pay for climate-related damage which they did not cause, but fearing a wave of litigation claims, Western countries have resisted it. Last year, a tropical storm, followed quickly by a cyclone, displaced hundreds of thousands in Malawi, Mozambique and Madagascar. Mr Chakwera believes that vulnerable countries like Malawi would feel better supported if the Scottish Government and the model was replicated by other countries. This fight belongs to all of us, and I believe that this example will serve as a prototype of what could happen. Although world leaders agreed at COP27 in November to set up a loss and damage fund, the details have still to be finalised, and it could be years before it is funded. Poorer countries are still waiting for a promised £100 billion of climate financing, which was promised to be delivered by 2020. An MI5 spy who helped bring peace to Northern Ireland by defying orders has broken his silence to the BBC. He's revealed he met IRA leaders in March 1993, despite talks being called off by the British government after IRA bombs killed 2 young boys in England. What he said in that meeting encouraged them to declare the ceasefire and move towards the process that eventually led to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Peter Taylor has been trying to find the spy for almost 30 years. He has discovered that what the spy said during the talks was not authorised by the British government. The minutes of the meeting had been published by Sinn Féin, the IRA's political wing, in 1994. They allege that the spy said the final solution is union. This island will be as one. Those words are so controversial and so important, says Taylor in a BBC documentary, The MI5 Spy and the IRA Operation Chiffon. To unionists, such words would be seen as the ultimate betrayal. The journalist says he wanted to hear what was actually said from the spy's own lips, but to do that he would have to track him down. It is extremely rare to hear an MI5 officer talk about a secret operation like this. Its codename was Chiffon, and it was designed to get the IRA to call a ceasefire and embrace the political process. It was a seminal meeting that I believe in the long term culminated in the Good Friday Agreement 25 years ago, the veteran reporter says in the documentary. Set up in 1991, Operation Chiffon worked as a secret back channel of communication between the leaders of the IRA and the British government. By then, the conflict had caused more than 3,000 deaths. Taylor discovers that the spy was known to the IRA as Fred, but his real name is Robert. In the documentary, Robert reveals to Taylor that his face-to-face talks with the IRA on the 23rd of March 1993 had not been authorised by the British government. I was on my own, dealing at one remove with the IRA's leadership in the most crucial matter affecting Irish and probably British politics. I knew I had to succeed, and only consistency and patience would achieve this, he said. For years, he felt guilty for doing what he did. Yes, I misled the Prime Minister, so I misled the Queen as well. It was a hard and really very unpleasant thing to have on your conscience. I felt very alone. The IRA had just carried out a bomb attack in Warrington, injuring 50 people and killing 2 children aged 3 and 12. It put an end to the British government's willingness to engage with the IRA, and the secret meeting was called off at the last minute by then Prime Minister John Major. But Roberts had received a previous message from the IRA indicating they were shifting towards a political rather than military way forward, and was worried that by not turning up for the meeting, the embryonic peace process would be put in jeopardy. I had all sorts of thoughts going through my mind, a concern that I was going against my own government and the Queen, Robert tells Taylor in the documentary. After hours spent soul-searching in the countryside south of Stormont, this spy resolved to go ahead, defying his boss John Deverell, the head of MI5 in Northern Ireland, who had ordered him not to go. Senior Republicans Martin McGuinness and Jerry Kelly were at the meeting representing the leadership of the IRA and Sinn Féin. It lasted lasted around 3 hours and took place in Londonderry at the home of Brendan Duddy, a nationalist businessman passionate about peace. The Republicans had expected Robert to be accompanied by his boss and were suspicious that he had turned up alone. McGuinness did most of the talking. It was not a friendly interrogation, says Robert. During the meeting, Martin McGuinness asked what the intentions of the Brits were, believing that Robert was speaking as he had presented himself the British government representative. Robert said that the goal was ultimately to unify Ireland. His exact words were noted down in minutes written by Jerry Kelly. The final solution is union. It is going to happen anyway. The historical train Europe determines that. Unionists will have to change. This island will be as one. Robert admits to Taylor that he had no authority to make such a claim and that it flew directly in the face of British government policy. Those words are so incendiary and so important because they appear to indicate that behind the scenes the British government had a policy that it wasn't divulging at this stage to work towards Irish unity, explains Taylor. His words appeared to have resonated with the Republicans. Speaking to Taylor in February, Jerry Kelly described the meeting as a seminal moment. We were told he was a British government representative. We just took him at his word. That's what he was there for. He would represent the British government and therefore we were talking to the British government, says Mr. Kelly. It gave hope there was a possibility of a peace process through meaningful talks. I think he, Robert, did the right thing and he can claim to have been part of history. During a break in the meeting, the host Brendan Duddy said to Robert, I think you've got them. I think they're going to call a ceasefire. Robert did not come clean with the British government about the meeting, but the secret came out later in the year, 28th of November 1993, when the Observer ran a front page scoop revealing that a British official had secretly met the IRA 3 days after the Warrington bomb. This is hugely embarrassing because the government had repeatedly denied that there had been any face-to-face meetings with the IRA, Taylor explains in the documentary. Robert resigned from the service. Taylor tracked him down more than 20 years ago. The trail to Robert was triggered by a signed inscription in a book The Spy presented to Brendan Duddy. The inscription, a quote in Latin from Virgil's Aeneid, translated, "Perhaps one day it will be good to remember these things," and was signed by Robert. But following MI5's rules, he lied to Taylor and said he wasn't the man he was looking for. But in 2021, the journalist received a letter. Dear Mr. Taylor, you will no doubt be surprised to hear from me after so many years. For a variety of reasons, I could now give you some background which might fill in some gaps. Were you so interested? Two of the leading figures from my involvement had died, Martin McGuinness and Brendan Duddy. The third, crucially for me, is my wife. It is her death which puts me in a position to contact you. Yours sincerely, Robert. I'd like what I did to be remembered, he tells Taylor in the documentary. Finance ministers of the world's largest economies have failed to agree on a closing statement following a summit in India, after China refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Beijing declined to accept parts of the G20 statement that deplored Russia's aggression in the strongest terms. Moscow said anti-Russian Western countries had destabilized the G20. It comes after China this week published a plan to end the conflict that was viewed by some as pro-Russian. India, which hosted this week's G20 talks in the southern city of Bengaluru, issued a wide-ranging chair's summary from the meeting, noting there were different assessments of the situation in Ukraine and on sanctions imposed on Russia. A footnote said that 2 paragraphs summarizing the war were agreed by all member countries except Russia and China. The paragraphs were adapted from the G20 Bali Leaders Declaration in November and criticized in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. After taking a backseat since the invasion a year ago, Beijing has stepped up its diplomacy efforts surrounding the conflict in recent weeks. Its top diplomat Yang Wang-yi toured Europe this week, culminating in a warm welcome by Russian President Vladimir Putin and Moscow. China also this week published a 12-point plan for ending the war in Ukraine, in which it called for peace talks and respect for national sovereignty. However, the 12-point document did not specifically say that Russia must withdraw its troops from Ukraine and did not condemn Russia's invasion. The Chinese document was welcomed by Russia, prompting US President Joe Biden to comment, "President Putin's applauding it, so how could it be any good?" After the G20 meeting, AJ Seth, a senior Indian official, said in a press conference that Russian and Chinese representatives did not agree to the wording on Ukraine because their mandate is to deal with economic and financial issues. On the other hand, all the other 18 countries felt that the war has got implications for the global economy and needed to be mentioned, he added. The 17-paragraph summary of the summit also referenced the recent earthquake in Turkey, debt in low and middle income countries, global tax policy, and food insecurity. Russia's foreign ministry said it regretted the fact that the activities of the G20 established by the Western collective and used in an anti-Russian way. It accused the United States, European Union, and G7 nations of clear blackmail, urging them to acknowledge the objective realities of a multipolar world. But German Finance Minister Christian Lindner said this is a war and this war has one cause, and that is Russia and Vladimir Putin. That must be expressed clearly at this G20 finance meeting. Previous meetings of G20 members have also failed failed to produce a joint statement since Russia invaded Ukraine last February. On Thursday, the UN General Assembly in New York overwhelmingly backed a resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The motion was backed by 141 nations, with 32 abstaining and 7, including Russia, voting against them. 8 pallbearers who carried Queen Elizabeth II's coffin at her funeral are among those to be recognised in a special honours list. King Charles has honoured scores of royal aides and military personnel for the roles they played during the period of national mourning. Angela Kelly, the Queen's dresser, has also received recognition. Queen Elizabeth II, Britain's longest-serving monarch, died at Balmoral in September last year, aged 96. In some of the most poignant moments of the late Queen's funeral, 8 Grenadier Guards in uniform carried her coffin, draped in the Royal Standard, into London's Westminster Abbey and her final resting place at St George's Chapel in Windsor. Millions of people around the world watched as Lance Sergeant Alex Turner, Lance Corporal Tony Flynn, Lance Sergeant Elias Orlowski, Guardsman Fletcher Cox, Guardsman James Patterson, Lance Sergeant Ryan Griffiths, Guardsman Luke Simpson, and Guardsman David Sanderson carried out their duty. Notably, they carried a lead-lined coffin with the imperial state crown, sceptre and orb on top at the steep steps of the chapel in Windsor Castle's grounds. Conservative MP Tom Hunt said at the time, "I can't imagine how hard and emotionally challenging it must have been to have carried Her late Majesty's coffin just once. With billions watching, they've done Her late Majesty and the country proud." The soldiers from the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards have been recognised with the Royal Victorian Medal in silver. Royal Regiment of Scotland pallbearers who brought the Queen from Balmoral to her lying in state at St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh received the same honour. The Royal Air Force flight crew who transported the Queen's coffin from Scotland to London, other coffin bearers and senior government officials are also included in the demise honours list. Miss Kelly, who worked for the Queen for more than 25 years, has been made a Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, RVO. The pair are understood to have had a close relationship, and the Queen gave Miss Kelly permission to write a behind-the-scenes account of her years as her official dressmaker and friend. Miss Kelly helped to keep the Queen's style modern and relevant. The late monarch once wore a pair of glasses personalised with Swarovski crystals in the shape of the letter Q at a 2010 film screening in Canada. During the height of the COVID pandemic, Miss Kelly is thought to have isolated with the Queen at Windsor Castle as part of a small group of royal household staff. The late Queen's page, Paul Wybrew, who appeared in the monarch's 2012 London Olympic skit with James Bond actor Daniel Craig, was awarded Commander of the RVO. Terence Pendry, who worked as the Queen's stud groom and held the reins of her pony Emma as the funeral cortege travelled through Windsor, received the same honour. Former ladies-in-waiting Philippa de Pass and Jennifer Gordon-Lennox were made Dame Commanders of the RVO. The RVO is bestowed by the King and not on the advice of the Prime Minister to people who have served the monarch and the royal family. The honour was founded by Queen Victoria in 1896. 2 years ago, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced ambitious plans to make India a green energy colossus. He pledged cutting emissions to net zero or becoming carbon neutral, meaning not adding to the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by 2070. Although its demand for power and emissions are lower than Western countries, India is the world's 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Mr. Modi also promised for India to get half of its energy from renewable resources by 2030, and by the same year to slash projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tonnes. One businessman who's key to Mr. Modi's green energy plans is Gautam Adani, one of Asia's richest men who runs a sprawling port-to-energy conglomerate with 7 publicly traded companies, including a renewable energy firm called Adani Green Energy. Mr. Adani plans to spend $70 billion in green energy and become a global renewable player by 2030. This money is expected to be spent on hybrid renewable power generation, making batteries and solar panels, and using wind energy and green hydrogen. But Mr. Adani's recent troubles have raised concerns about whether this means a setback for India's soaring energy ambitions. The listed companies in his group have seen some $120 billion wiped off their market value after the US-based investment firm Heidenberg Research published a report accusing it of decades of brazen stock manipulation and accounting fraud. The group has dismissed the allegations as malicious and untrue, calling them an attack on India. In the first sign of investors getting skittish, Total Energies, a French oil and gas group, put on pause a planned $4 billion investment in a green hydrogen project with the Adani Group until there was more clarity on the situation. Total has already invested more than $3 billion in energy projects with the group. To calm investors, the group has said that its companies face no material refinancing risk or near-term liquidity issues. A spokesperson for the Adani Group told the BBC, "We do not anticipate change in energy transition plans of the Adani portfolio. Experts believe it is too early to determine the impact of recent developments on India's climate plans. The Adani Group is a big player in the green energy space. Some of the fresh investments may be delayed if they are not able to raise more financing. It will have some impact on green energy investments that it had originally planned," says Vibhuti Garg of the Institute of Energy energy economics and financial analysis. But the momentum in renewable energy will continue. In the coming decades, India's energy transition will be the biggest in the world. With 1.4 billion people, the country still needs to hook up large swathes of population and the last holdouts with power. India adds a city the size of London to its urban population every year. Industrial activity is increasing. There are more extreme weather events like heat waves. A push towards electrical vehicles will further exacerbate demand for power. Not surprisingly, the electricity regulator reckons that demand is expected to double in the next 5 years. India is the world's second largest producer and consumer of coal. 3/4 of the electricity produced uses coal, and India is still building thermal plants. Yet the plan is that most of the additional capacity will come from renewable resources. And to reach net zero emissions by 2070, India needs $160 billion every year between now and 2030, according to the International Energy Agency. That's 3 times today's level of investment. Apart from the Adani Group, the other big player in green energy are the Ambanis. Mukesh Ambani of Reliance Group, India's biggest firm, plans to spend $80 billion on renewable power projects in the western state of Gujarat. Energy giant Tata Group is also revving up its clean energy play, yet experts say India's insatiable energy demand requires many more players. If we need to meet so much of energy demand, we need many more private players, a few big and many small, says Ashwini K. Swain of Centre for Policy Research, a Delhi-based think tank. He believes that the numbers of domestic green energy players has to grow. We cannot work with half a dozen players and a couple of players who are disproportionately big, he says. That's why the Adani Group's troubles could actually be an opportunity for other renewable energy players, says Tim Buckley of Australia-based Climate Energy Finance. He says he sees huge potential capacity for other national players to step up, leveraging their domestic skills and capacity, combined with expanding global capacity, capital access and interest in investing in Indian renewables and grid infrastructure. India's total generation capacity of clean and dirty energy is 400 GW, and it plans to add 500 GW in clean energy alone by 2030. It is an audacious ambition. A transition of this scale in a country which has demanded on coal and oil so far to meet its energy demands is not going to be easy. Mr. Swain believes India should stop expanding coal capacity and instead move to meeting its new demand from cleaner sources. For example, a fifth of India's electricity demand comes from irrigating its vast farms. Powering farms during daytime with solar energy can make everybody happy. India's progress on renewable energy has been remarkable. There may be some delays and slowdowns, but those should not hamper the renewable energy growth, says Mr. Gargs. London City Hall staff will no longer be allowed to use TikTok on official devices amid security concerns. The Greater London Authority, GLA, said the rule would apply to 1,200 staff. It mirrors a similar decision by the UK government to ban ministers for using the app on their work phones following a security review. TikTok strongly denied claims it gave users data to China's government and offered to meet Sadiq Khan to address what it called misconceptions. The app, which has exploded in popularity in recent years, gathers a lot of information on users, including their age, location, device, and even their typing rhythms. Its cookies also track users' activity elsewhere on the internet. US-based social media sites also do this, but TikTok's Chinese parent company ByteDance has faced claims of being influenced by Beijing. The UK Parliament made its decision on Thursday to ban the app from its network over security concerns, and it is a move the GLA wants to adopt too. A GLA spokesperson told BBC London the GLA takes information security extremely seriously. In line with the government's decision, TikTok will no longer be available on GLA devices. The Scottish government also announced on Thursday it would join the Welsh government in banning the app from official devices. In response to City Hall's announcement, TikTok said it believed the bans were based on fundamental misconceptions and driven by wider geopolitics. The spokesman for the app added, "We are readily available to meet with the mayor to address any concerns, but should be judged on facts and treated equally to our competitors. We have begun implementing a comprehensive plan to further protect our European user data, which includes storing UK user data in our European data centres and tightening data access controls, including third-party independent oversight of our approach." Last week, FIFA President Gianni Infantino announced record revenues in excess of $7.6 billion, with football's governing body also confirming plans for further expansion and growth. But does big money for the global game come at a big cost to the planet? And does that fit with FIFA's statement on sustainability and emissions reductions? FIFA's expansion plans include confirmed expansion of the Men's Club World Cup from 7 teams to 32, growing the Men's World Cup from 32 teams to 48, and staging it across a continent in 2026. Increasing the number of teams at the Women's World Cup from 24 to 32, hosting an entirely new Women's World Cup qualifying tournament for 10 teams in New Zealand, and plans to introduce a new Women's Club World Cup. FIFA's claimed that the Qatar World Cup was carbon neutral was considered by experts experts to be misleading and dangerous, and its plans for further expansion come in spite of the fact FIFA's environmental strategy includes having signed up to the UN Sport for Climate Action framework, with a target of net zero by 2040 and halving of emissions by 2030. The majority of sport's carbon footprint comes from fan travel. Last year, FIFA estimated about 1 million supporters would travel to Qatar for the Men's World Cup, and more teams in 2026 will mean more fans, with the same applying to the expanded Club World Cup. Wycombe Wanderers player David Wheeler, Professional Footballers Association Sustainability Champion, described the 2026 World Cup logistics as a nonsense and a money-making exercise. He also questioned the quality of the football in expanded tournaments such as the Club World Cup, comparing it to junk food. We're damaging the climate, and the climate is sick and potentially terminally ill, said Wheeler. We know how to reverse course, but instead we're doing the very thing that's making it sick, and that's what I think FIFA is suggesting to do. In the women's game, there are fewer travelling fans compared with the men's, but the number is growing, and FIFA has announced more than 500,000 ticket sales for this summer's Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. However, a newly created qualifying tournament with 10 teams flying to New Zealand for 13 new games in the calendar to decide the final 3 places has been called unnecessary. Ireland and Reading defender Diana Caldwell, who will be at her country's first Women's World Cup, said, "I'm sure FIFA will say they've done it to help the women's game grow. Of course we all want the game to grow, but it can be done in a sustainable way and not by flying 10 teams from different continents to New Zealand to compete. I think definitely it could have been avoided." Caldwell, who is part of We Play Green, a group of football players speaking up on environmental issues, added, "They need to really re-evaluate what's going to be their long-term ethos. Is it going to be profit over planet? You can't forget the power that football has. It's the most followed sport in the world. If football cares about the climate crisis and actually demonstrates cutting emissions, can you imagine the impact that could have on billions of fans across the world?" New Zealand and Hearts forward Katie Rood added, "The sooner we adapt and change, the longer we can play and keep enjoying these tournaments. If we truly have our future at the heart of our decisions, then we can keep talking about expansion and growth of these major tournaments. These are the pinnacle events. You want the best of the best. If you're continuously expanding, you kind of lose the heart of what that was all about in the first place. What does the World Cup mean? Is it for them, for the athletes, for the fans, or is it for the advertisers and for the profits?" Dr. Madeline Orr, a sport ecologist based in Loughborough University, said she was sceptical of FIFA and said its growth plans were completely contradictory to sustainability goals. She added that football should start to consider smaller venues, smaller scope and scale of tournaments, meaning fewer fans, to prioritise local supporters. "We have this influential power that is not being tapped," she added. "We have more airtime, more media coverage because of sport, and to not use that platform to send a bigger message about sustainability is a missed goal." In a response to BBC Sport, FIFA said the new Women's World Cup playoff tournament was a collective decision, and that it is fully aware that climate change is one of the most pressing challenges of our time, and that as an organisation it has been making substantial efforts to tackle those impacts and at the same time to use opportunities to maximise the positive effects of its most iconic tournaments. "We remain committed to continuously improving our approaches." Alexa recordings were used to piece together how a domestic abuser murdered his wife. Daniel White, aged 36, kicked open Angie White's locked bedroom door, strangled her and cut her throat. He then fled the house in Swansea in his wife's car before phoning police to confess in October 2022. White from Idris Terrace Plasmal was given a life sentence of at least 20 years and 10 months at Swansea Crown Court after admitting murder. Officers went to their home where they found the front door locked and the body of Miss White, aged 45, in her bedroom. Swansea Crown Court heard labourer White had a long history of domestic violence, including against Miss White. At the time of the murder, he was on licence from prison after receiving a 10-year extended sentence for rape and assault. Fearful of her husband, Miss White had installed a mortise lock on her bedroom door, which White kicked in after an argument started on WhatsApp. Neighbours heard banging, shouting and screaming at about 3 a.m. on the 22nd of October last year before hearing a car drive away. Shortly before 6 a.m, White called police, telling a call handler, "I strangled her and cut her throat. She's dead." We argued and she locked the door and said she wanted me out. All I wanted to do was take my stuff and leave. I just shut her up. I strangled her, I ran downstairs and I cut her throat to make sure she was dead. The court heard the couple had an Amazon Alexa, which can control household electrical items when activated by a voice prompt. Detectives discovered voice command ones made by White and his wife at the time of the murder, had been saved. Prosecutor William Hughes said police have been able to discover that at 3:03 a.m, Angie in her bedroom said, "Alexa, volume 3. At 3:16 a.m, Daniel White's voice can be heard saying, "Alexa, stop." He then goes back downstairs into the living room and says, "Turn on Alexa," but what can also be heard is that he is out of breath, and these appear to be the moments when the Crown say he's gone to get the knife. He then returns to the bedroom at 3:18 a.m. when he says, "Alexa, turn on the electric light," and at 3:19 a.m. he says, "Alexa, turn off the TV." So the Crown's reasonable interpretation is after 3:03 a.m. and before 3:16 a.m. Daniel White had burst through the door and initially strangled Angie, then went downstairs to get the knife and thereafter cut her throat. The court heard the couple had begun arguing on WhatsApp. The last message they exchanged was at 3:11. A pathologist found Miss White's died from knife wounds to her neck, but there was also evidence she had been strangled. White previously admitted murder but refused to attend court for sentencing. Defense barrister Peter Rauch said the marriage was effectively over and what happened was a spontaneous act of violence. He said, "I'm not suggesting that is justification, but Your Honour has asked what led to it, and it would seem by putting the picture together as best one can, the messages and timings, that seems to be what has taken place." Judge Paul Thomas branded White a coward. He does not have the courage to face the family and friends of the woman whose life he so brutally ended. You have a disgraceful history of assaulting women who have had the great misfortune to be in a relationship with you. Judge Thomas dubbed White a serious danger to women. He said, "When you entered the bedroom, you strangled her, probably rendering her unconscious. When she was face to face with you with your hands around her throat, she must have been absolutely terrified. After she probably lost consciousness, you didn't seek help for her, you went downstairs and got a knife. You took it into her bedroom in order to kill her, to finish her off." The judge said he had a cowardly desire to dominate her. He added, "You did just that. You savagely slit her throat, knowing that would kill her." Speaking afterwards, Mrs. White's family said Angie was a much-loved daughter, sister, mother, grandmother, and auntie. "Nothing can bring our beloved Angie back. We shall miss that silly giggle forevermore." Daniel White admitted his guilt, but continued to use his manipulative behaviour to delay the outcome. He deliberately absences himself in what we see as his continuing attempts to control this situation, and his cowardliness in avoiding facing us, and justice for what he did to Angie. A Ministry of Justice spokesman said a review was underway. "This was a horrific crime, and our sympathies are with the family and friends of Angie White, as well as with all serious further offences. A review is now underway, and it would be inappropriate for us to comment further at this stage. Serious further offences are rare, but we are investing £155 million more every year into the probation service to improve the supervision of offenders and recruit thousands more staff to keep the public safe." A woman whose childhood pen pal suddenly stopped writing after fleeing the Rwanda genocide has written a novel to exercise the grief of not knowing what happened to her. Sophie Buchelard's pen pal Victoria, aged 16, was separated from her parents while fleeing the 1994 genocide, in which an estimated 800,000 people were killed. Victoria was staying at a refugee camp in Goma, Democratic Republic of the Congo. The pair corresponded frequently until one day Victoria wrote that she was being moved and would get back in touch as soon as she could. "I never heard back," said Sophie. Sophie was living in Paris and was also 16 at the time, wrote to Victoria's teachers at the camp, and was put in touch with a charity in Rwanda that reunites people, but to no avail. At first she feared she had been offending her friend, but as months turned into years, she began to realise the carelessness of the situation her friend had found herself in. "Growing up, it dawned on me that something terrible may have happened. She might have died or been killed, or all sorts of other things could have happened to her," said Sophie, who now lives in Penna, Vale of Glamorgan. "It's only when I started doing research retrospectively that I understood the full scale of what life in the camp must have been. In the 90s, it was more common for children to have pen pals from far-flung places, and the unlikely friendship was forged when Sophie's school put her in touch with Victoria. Victoria wanted to be a translator, so it was an opportunity for her to correspond in French. When we started to write, I would have been cosy at home in my parents' flat in Paris, and she would have been in the refugee camp in Goma. Our experiences couldn't have been more different," said Sophie. She remembered Victoria said she was from the Kigali area. Her father worked in the local administration there, and before the genocide they had lived in a house with a garden. Sophie said despite Victoria's horrific situation, there was a strange normality about her letters, and they wrote about normal 16-year-old things. She was more focused on what life had been like before, the life she would have returned to, and treating that moment in the refugee camp as a blip, as a parenthesis outside of normal. She said her friend always came across as very calm. "It occurred to me later in life that what I assumed was calmness was probably trauma. It would have been difficult for her to process all of that at the time." After the letters stopped, Sophie said she was concerned for a friend friend, but never completely gave up hope that she was okay. I always hoped that she just went back to her normal life and that it was more desirable not to continue to write, she said. A couple of years after a final letter from Victoria, Sophie went to university. Later, she lived in Spain and the US before coming to the UK as a student in 2001, getting married and settling in South Wales. She never forgot Victoria and would find herself writing poems and short stories about her friend. Writing has very powerful cathartic abilities and makes it possible to access the subconscious, I suppose. In her 40s, Sophie decided to leave her job at Cardiff University and study a master's in creative writing with the hope of becoming a writer. She began writing and once again Victoria appeared on her page. This led her to spend 7 months researching Rwanda before writing her master's portfolio, which became the beginning of her novel This Is Not Who You Are. The novel follows the lives of two women, Iris from Paris and Victoria from Rwanda. 20 years after their unlikely pen pal correspondence comes to a sudden end, Iris is working as a journalist in London and sets about trying to find her pen friend. Part of it was trying to articulate life as a migrant myself in the UK at the time of Brexit and trying to find out what happens when the country where you live tells you very loud and clear that you're not welcome. It was also about trying to work through the nagging, unanswered questions she had about Victoria. Part of the exercise for me was a way to maybe find out what happened to Victoria. It was a way to exercise the grief of not knowing what happened. As soon as the book was published, Sophie sent 10 books to Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda in hope that someone would read her book and recognise the story. I'm of a hopeful nature, and I think in hope that the writing of the book somehow will touch someone who knows what happened to her. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has unveiled the contents of his first budget in the House of Commons. It had a focus on prompting those who have left jobs to return to the workforce and boosting business investment. So we're going to look at a recap of some of the main parts of the speech. In terms of fuel, alcohol, pensions and wages, there is a cap on the amount workers can accumulate in pensions savings over their lifetime before having to pay extra tax. Currently, the threshold lasts at 1.07 million to be abolished. Tax-free yearly allowance for pension pot is to rise from £40,000 to £60,000, having been frozen for 9 years. Fuel duty has been frozen. The 5p cut to fuel duty on petrol and diesel, due to end in April, is been kept for another year. Alcohol taxes to rise in line with inflation from August, with new reliefs for beer, cider and wine sold in pubs, and a tax on tobacco to increase by 2% above inflation and 6% above inflation for hand rolling tobacco. In terms of energy bills, prepayment meters and nuclear power, government subsidies limiting typical household energy bills to £2,500 a year have been extended for 3 months until the end of June. There's a £200 million to bring energy charges for prepayment meters into line with prices for customers paying by direct debit, which affects 4 million households. There is a commitment to invest £20 billion over the next 2 decades on low carbon energy projects with focus on carbon capture and storage. Nuclear energy is to be classed as environmentally sustainable for investment purposes, with promise of more public funding, and £63 million to help leisure centres with rising swimming pool heating costs and investment to become more energy efficient. In terms of childcare, universal credit and back to work plans, 30 hours of free childcare for working parents in England is to be expanded to cover 1 and 2 year olds, to be rolled out in stages from April 2024. Families on universal credit are to receive childcare support up front instead of in arrears, with the £646 a month per child cap raised to £951. There is a £600 incentive payments for those becoming childminders, and relaxed rules in England to let childminders look after more children. There is a new fitness to work testing regime to qualify for health-related benefits. New voluntary employment scheme for disabled people in England and Wales called Universal Support. There are tougher requirements to look for work and increased job support for lead child carers on universal credit. £63 million has been offered for programs to encourage retirees over 50 back to work called returnships and skills boot camps, and immigration rules are to be relaxed for 5 roles in construction sectors to ease labour shortages. In terms of the government debt, inflation and economic growth, the Office for Budget Responsibility predicts the UK will avoid recession in 2023, but the economy will shrink by 0.2%. The growth of 1.8% predicted for next year, with 2.5% in 2025 and 2.1% in 2026. The UK's inflation rate is predicted to fall to 2.9% by the end of the year, down from 10.7% in the last 3 months of 2022, and underlying debt forecast to be 92.4% of GDP this year, rising to 93.7% in 2024. Corporation tax, investment zones and tax breaks. The main rate of corporation tax paid by businesses on taxable profits over £250,000 has been confirmed to increase from 90% to 25%. Companies with profits between £50,000 and £250,000 pay between 19% and 25%. Companies able to deduct investment in new machinery and technology to lower their taxable profits. Tax breaks and other benefits for 12 new investment zones across the UK, funded by £80 million each over the next 5 years. And reduced paperwork for international traders, who will also be given longer to submit customs forms under streamlined rules. In terms of other measurements, commitment to raise defence spending by £11 billion over the next 5 years. Prison sentences for those convicted of marketing tax avoidance schemes. £200 million this year to help local councils in England repair potholes. An extra £10 million over the next 2 years for charities in England helping to prevent suicide. Streamlined approvals process promised for new medical products. And £900 million for new supercomputer facilities to help UK's artificial intelligence industries. Charles III's state visit to France has been postponed after a request by President Emmanuel Macron, Downing Street says. The President said we would not be sensible and would lack common sense to go ahead after unions called a day of pension protest during the visit. The trip to Paris and Bordeaux had been due to begin on Sunday, but both cities were caught up in violence on Thursday, some of the worst since demonstrations began in January. Buckingham Palace said the decision to postpone the 3-day visit by Charles III and Camilla, Queen Consort, was due to the situation in France. Their Majesties greatly look forward to the opportunity to visit France as soon as dates can be found, the statement added. President Macron said that from the moment on Thursday night when unions announced a 10th National Day of Action for Tuesday, 2 days into the state visit, he felt it would be inappropriate for the King and Camilla to travel. As we have considerable friendship, respect and esteem for His Majesty and the Queen Consort and the British people, I took the initiative this morning to call the King and explain the situation. Common sense and friendship led us to suggest a postponement. The UK government added the decision had been taken with consent of all parties. Mr Macron said France had proposed moving the trip to early summer when things calmed down again. The decision is a significant loss of face for France and for President Macron. This was supposed to have been a showcase for France, introducing the new monarch to the best of French life and cementing a newly awakened friendship. The president's opponents on the left and right reacted fast. Eric Ciotti of the Republicans said the cancellation brought shame on our country, while Jean-Luc Mélenchon on the far left was delighted the meeting of King at Versailles had been broken up, adding that the English knew that France's interior ministry was pathetic on security. The protesters had made the trip impossible. Several French cities saw violence on the sidelines of Thursday's largely peaceful demonstrations that attracted more than 1 million people. The entrance to the town hall in Bordeaux was set alight in Paris. Tear gas was fired and the Interior Minister, Gerald Darmanin, said 903 fires were lit. In a city where refuse had been left uncollected since the 6th of March. Hundreds of police officers were hurt across France, but protesters were injured by stun grenades, and the Council of Europe said there was no justification for excessive force by authorities. For much of Friday morning, French officials had sought to reassure the public that the state visit from the 26th to the 29th of March would go ahead and that security was in place. Some UK journalists had already travelled to Paris to cover the event. This was a hugely important trip for the King, a first state visit and to one of the UK's closest and oldest allies. The King and Camilla were due to ride along the Champs-Élysées in the heart of Paris and had a banquet at the Versailles with President Macron. Camilla was expected to open an art exhibition at one of the main Paris attractions, the Musée d'Orsay. They were then expected to head to Bordeaux. But every step of the visit was at risk of being targeted by protests, and eventually it was cancelled. Even the people who roll out the red carpets were planning strike action. Interior Minister Mr Darmanin said earlier on Friday that there were no known threats to the King. Bordeaux Mayor Pierre Hermec said the trip to a city had been adapted so it can go ahead under the best security, so as not to expose the King to the slightest difficulty. However, facing the prospect of showing the King through rubbish and graffiti-strewn streets, with every public appearance smothered in security and every movement threatened by strikes, the French president made the obvious choice. It may have been a joint decision with the UK government, but it was the one under pressure. The trip to Bordeaux, originally intended to focus on organic vineyards, went up in flames. The town hall, its front door set alight on Thursday, was due to be part of the visit. Domestically, the image would have played badly for the president. Dining with the King in Versailles would have been jarringly inappropriate and could have played rather too directly into the hands of his detractors. A TV interview that President Macron gave on the eve of Thursday's national action appeared to galvanise protesters when he described the government's reforms as an economic necessity, saying he was prepared to accept the resulting unpopularity. His government decided on Monday to force through the reforms, which raised the pension age from 62 to 64 and extend contributions by workers to 43 years. As the President and Prime Minister realised they would struggle to pass the law in the National Assembly, they resorted to a constitutional power to bypass a vote. quote, "I listened to Macron yesterday and it was as if someone was spitting in our face," said Adele, a 19-year-old law student in Nanterre. "For this pension reform, there is another way, and if he doesn't do that, it's because he's not listening to the people. There's a clear lack of democracy." While the postponement will be highly embarrassing for President Macron, it will also be disappointing for King Charles. State visits are made on the advice of the government, or the background briefing had been that this was an important diplomatic statement about rebuilding relationships with European neighbours. The King and Camilla were due to travel from France to Germany on Wednesday. Charles's first state visit will instead begin in Berlin.